So we're switching to Puget Sound. Dr. Bill Labiosa serves as the Regional Science Coordinator for the USGS Northwest Regional Office. As Regional Science Coordinator, he develops and coordinates USGS strategic science efforts that support multi-partner management and recovery of major ecosystems, particularly in the USGS Northwest region. He also worked closely with USGS science centers in his region to help align USGS's capabilities with the needs of the Department of Interior and other federal, tribal, state, and local partners. Dr. Scott Redman is Program Manager at the Puget Sound Partnership, where he develops and implements approaches to reduce input of toxic chemicals to Puget Sound by working with other governments, non-governmental organizations, and businesses. His research interests include aquatic ecosystem study, protection, and restoration with focus on toxic contaminants, marine shoreline habitats, and collaborative approaches to science and management. And Bill and Scott will be splitting the presentation in some way.
Yes, you can hear me okay? We're actually going to be toggling back and forth a little bit, so don't get confused. It'll either be me talking or him talking, and we know, hopefully know right. when those two different things should be happening. So we're going to take you to the land of orcas and salmon and volcanoes and this very strange fjord that's carved out by glaciers, a beautiful place, and highly unusual as well. Okay, so I'm not going to really go through the outline. We followed the format that was given to us. We're going to try to answer all of the questions provided. So the advantage to doing that is we now don't have to go through the outline. And so actually, I'm now going to turn this over to Scott.
All right. So I think we'll cover both the history of the program and the major management issues, the resource issues, as we go through this next series of slides. So the history of people's attention to Puget Sound needing a Clean Water Act kind of protection or Endangered Species Act is on these next three slides. And so going back about 30 some years, the state of Washington, primarily in response to some water quality issues, passed a statute related to let's focus on Puget Sound. So we started to create some institutional arrangements, including the first of many, a series of state agencies. The first one was called the Puget Sound Water Quality Authority. And at that point, they started with a real expectation that this would be a science-informed process. There were conferences and research committees brought together, really outlining what would need to be done. And I think there was a vision that was never quite brought to reality back in that point. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, Puget Sound was actually named as an estuary of national significance. The story we tell there is we were the first of the 28 programs. I'm not sure if that's true, but you know how programs are. Mm-hmm. There are 28 national estuary programs. I think there's one right in the area of coastal Louisiana that Denise was just talking about. There's one near here. And then I think the other programs that are here today don't really have these national estuary programs. This is a key feature that I will talk about. What this means is that one of our key federal partners is EPA. But it also means that we started with very much a Clean Water Act, a water quality standards, a contaminated sediments kind of focus. So that's where we began. Next slide. Bringing us a little bit closer to the current day, we have begun to focus in the mid-1990s then on habitat concerns. And I'd say this began with concern about wetlands, so close to Clean Water Act kinds of things. But then what happened in the late 1990s was the listing of Puget Sound Chinook as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So we started to actually think about habitat for Chinook and other salmon as part of the National Estuary Program problem and as part of the state's interest in the future of Puget Sound. And at this point, we really created at least two, there likely were many more, but two primary state-focused efforts. The Puget Sound National Estuary Program a version of work transitioned into the governor's office from being an independent agency. And I came on board at about this time to manage a monitoring program, which was really about that was the key feature. That and a biennial conference were kind of the key features of the science program of that effort. So if you think of Denise's slide, which showed monitoring, research, and modeling, we had an emphasis from this time, and I think this continues to today, to focus more on monitoring than other topics. But it broadened through those years into monitoring of water quality and habitat. I would say, and Ken Currens is here in the audience somewhere, I think I saw him over here, he was one of the science advisors for the shared strategy of Puget Sound. We took a unique approach in Washington State of having the local affected community build the recovery plan for Puget Sound Chinook, and it was done at the scale of these 22 populations in 16 watersheds. So that's what I've labeled there as the Washington Way. So part of what this brings up is this need to have the science work at the scale of appropriate units of analysis, and for salmon that was pretty clear, it was these watersheds. As we continue the story on the next slide, you'll see as we get closer to present day, we've also brought that kind of units of analysis work forward in the Puget Sound Nearshore partnership, which began in 2001, has been slightly dormant in recent years, and I think is picking up steam again. The Nearshore partnership has really focused on a process-based approach to restoration of Puget Sound's shorelines. And so a process focus, and the units of analysis, therefore, have been drift cells. And I think that was really instrumental to focus, to learn what the focus of analysis should be, and to do some good science to articulate the problem, and then the potential solutions. Concurrent with that, the National Estuary Program version of work in Puget Sound morphed yet again in 2007, and this was really in order to try to better blend the Endangered Species Act related work around shared strategy and the prior work on water quality. So beginning in 2007, actually a project that took about the calendar year 2006, we really built a design, and then it got through the legislature in early 2007. And we now work under this integrated approach to these topics, and we'll come back to this in a minute.
So on the heels of the creation of the Puget Sound Partnership, the Puget Sound Federal Caucus was formed. The initial purpose of that, as you can imagine, was to bring federal capabilities and resources into play to help support the state-led recovery of Puget Sound. But, you know, right away, things were a little bit sidelined because a particular issue came up that really began to dominate our agenda and moved us away a little bit of Puget Sound recovery in general. And I'm actually going to toggle between two slides because this issue is extremely important within Puget Sound recovery, but it's highly focused on tribal treaty rights at risk. You really can't understand Puget Sound ecosystem recovery without understanding the importance of tribal rights and tribal issues. So as we were beginning to get in the gear of supporting ecosystem recovery, the tribes published, the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission published a white paper in 2011 documenting the continued habitat loss and its impact on salmon recovery in spite of the ESA-related, Endangered Species Act-related recovery efforts to date. It was a very powerful paper, and it had a very big impact. You can tell that that their legal case was very strong because the Department of Justice and the White House Council on Environmental Quality immediately directed the Puget Sound Federal Caucus to focus entirely on developing a response to the treaty rights at risk issue, and in particular to develop an interagency work plan to address the issue. And so that really dominated our agenda entirely from around 2011 to 2015. So, you know, there's a good and bad side to that. On the good side, I buy into the argument that what's good for tribal treaty rights is good for Puget Sound ecosystem recovery. It's a very strong argument. On the other hand, science and monitoring went completely to the back seat on the federal side because the tribes said explicitly that they didn't want to talk about science and monitoring in the work plan. They wanted to talk about what the federal government was going to do to stop continued habitat loss. Now, the challenge there, of course, is that this habitat loss goes right into land use decision-making, local government level kind of things, and the feds, you know, what do the feds do there? So we're really trying to uncrack that nut in this work plan, and it's a very complicated set of issues that we're trying to get on top of. But if you fast forward to, excuse me, up is back, okay. If you fast forward to last week, there was a major announcement on Puget Sound. So just out of curiosity, how many of you saw that? It was in the national media. Not too many. So last week, Christy Goldfuss, the CEQ director, came to Washington State, and with Governor Inslee and the regional directors of the federal agencies and tribal leaders, announced a new memorandum of understanding between federal agencies to really revamp our support of Puget Sound ecosystem recovery in general. And tribal treaty rights will be a part of that, but we're really reinvigorating the larger focus. What I find very exciting in that is that the MOU has explicit language on science and monitoring and creates a science and monitoring work group to try to help marshal federal efforts in supporting Puget Sound ecosystem recovery through science and monitoring as well as, of course, on the action side. Okay, so I think now I will go down. And back to you, Scott.
All right. So in this slide, where I think we'll stay here for a minute. Go ahead and hit the button one more time. I think I'll further elaborate on what the management issues are for Puget Sound and some of the co-production that has occurred in setting up our recovery and protection approach. So the graphic shown here is widely used in the Puget Sound area to help convey the diversity of our concerns. We are often envious of places like coastal Louisiana who have cracked the nut of saying it's about building land. We've got these goals around the outside here. I think there are maybe 2 co-equal goals somewhere else, and we've got 6, okay? And one thing you'll see here is we're treating the Puget Sound ecosystem as a social ecological system. And human well-being, both human health and human quality of life, are critical elements of the future that we're aiming at. And then you'll see species, habitats, water quality, and water quantity. So this is really, we've modernized from the 1980s where we had that very water quality focus through to these other dimensions. And that's been a challenge to sort of grow the scientific engagement into those. So one of the important aspects of science engagement for us has just been knowing what do we mean when we say a healthy, recovered, and protected Puget Sound, and articulating from those fairly general goals, what do we mean? And in state statute, our science panel has, which Bill is a member, Tracy has been a member, Joel, who's here, is a member, Ken, who's here, is a member. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone, has the assignment to identify indicators for Puget Sound. Well, they took that on up to a point. They said, we'll recommend some indicators. We really think the policy boards ought to adopt the indicators. We did in 2010 adopt a suite of indicators that we now refer to as our vital signs. And for each of these vital signs, we have articulated, well, I shouldn't say for each, for many of these vital signs, we've articulated desired future conditions. We set targets with the planning horizon of 2020. That was an element of our state statute. Where do you want to be in 2020? So we're coming up on a time where we'll need to refresh those, but we have vital signs and targets, desired future conditions for those, and that was really a co-production issue of agreeing that that was a place to start from goals, get more specific, get science advice about desired future condition, but have the articulation of desired future condition be a policy statement. So our leadership council, 7 people appointed by the governor, adopted targets for these vital signs. The statute further articulates some of the how should we meet these goals. And so we have some direction to focus on some species of concern, imperiled species. We have the acronym PISNER here is for the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Program. Protecting and restoring habitat are called out, stormwater management is called out, certain kinds of pollution control are called out. And so we've built a program where from those indicators, we really need to articulate how will we manage stormwater, how will we manage the restoration of habitat that's been lost or process that's been impeded, or how will we protect existing habitat. And so I'd say we're in the midst of producing the science-based plans for accomplishing the targets that we've established, shown on that prior slide. Next. I'm going to jump here just into some of the communication and education programs. So I can argue that we've connected science into the decisions that are being made about the path forward. But I think somewhat independent of that work, we have spawned a variety of education and communication efforts. Some you'll see here, some you'll see on the next slide that Bill's going to talk about. But I think one of the things that's important is that our science program is it's poorly connected to these, and we don't know what these communication outlets could be used for. We're not focused on who their audiences are, what they need from us, but we do see both Washington Sea Grant and our Land Grant University's extension program has some key tools there in terms of water quality field agents, and that's a really nice connection between getting extension type services out to the communities and in the same organization where we get the Sea Grant research done. So there's an opportunity for interaction there. The second to last bullet, these eco-nets, has been a recent effort of ours just to kind of be the backbone to provide a service to get groups together so that they build from each other's capacities. I think what we've missed a little bit is what do we bring to those eco-nets so that they can distribute out to the broader community. And then on the last bullet, I mentioned that on stormwater management particularly, we have local governments. We have 120 local governments around Puget Sound who have some type of assignment to stormwater management. And part of that assignment is to maintain what goes into the stormwater system, and therefore to educate the people who own the property in their area. So there's a lot of work around preventing drips, managing things correctly. So there's a connection there to the local governments and the science that they do about of behavior management, of behavior. So there's a good connection to social science on that last part.
So on the federal side, on communication and education programs, there are some substantial efforts, but they're related to individual agency missions. So, for example, on the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, they provide very important training and technical assistance to farmers, very highly important in Puget Sound, riparian shading and issues like that, very important from the treaty rights at risk issue. In the Department of the Interior, we have a number of tribal education grants and projects. Tribal trustee responsibility of the Department of the Interior is very important, so those programs are funded and exist, but they aren't necessarily connected to Puget Sound ecosystem recovery directly. NOAA has a number of programs and, for example, the Western Fisheries Science Camp to teach young people about issues that are related to salmon recovery, among other things. And of course, the EPA National Estuary Program funding to support the state efforts that Scott was talking about. Some of that money is there. So I think individual efforts are important, but there's just a lack of coordination among these programs. Again, it's not in service of Puget Sound ecosystem recovery per se, and I think it could greatly benefit from that, taking it to that next level of being coordinated in service of Puget Sound ecosystem recovery.
So these next couple of slides, and I'll do this one and hand it over to Bill for the next, articulate the multi-part science infrastructure that we have in Puget Sound. So on this slide, we're going to focus on those that kind of build from the National Estuary Program focus, but that also includes some of the salmon recovery assignment that we have going forward. The Puget Sound Partnership is authorized to have a scientific research account. We have never been appropriated for that. So ideally, there would be a second bullet or a third bullet in that first part about, so we have a panel, volunteer panel, note. We have some staff, largely that work on the Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program, but we don't have funds. Not even the number that you have to divide by 5 and then by 15 that Denise offered. You know, it's zero, okay? But we do have an ecosystem monitoring program. I think the theory of the Puget Sound Partnership and the ecosystem monitoring program is that it's wise to invest in the backbone of the collaborative effort. Okay, so where we have quite limited resources, we provide a small number of staff to convene work groups and a steering committee around ecosystem monitoring. And the ecosystem monitoring program addresses both status and trends questions. We ask them to be our source for the material about those vital signs and their indicators. We also expect that they'll tell us about other signals from monitoring the system. And for instance, there's a marine waters work group that puts out an annual marine waters year in review. And they just put out their 2015 report. It's a really nice collaboration. It comes about because a work group, which we fund a small fraction of an FTE to staff that work group. That work group has routine meetings, a workshop in the spring, and 6 months on is able to bring up a synthesis report about how was that year. Now it's frustrating that that's just a year at a time, but there's a synthesis provided there by that structure. And we have work groups to deal with a variety of topics: toxic contaminants, forage fish, birds. So we cover our interests through people's finding time and willingness to join colleagues in routine meetings. And then finally, the last bullet is beginning about 5 years ago, we have at University of Washington, the Puget Sound Institute, and Joel Baker, who's here and you'll hear from later, is the director of that institute, and what that provides nicely is a bridge. Another version of Backbone is this border organization where we connect the scientific community into the management concern. So this is another intent towards co-production. I think this is also a design that's not fully executed yet, not well funded. And so when the last bullet talks about convening panels of experts, there's been relatively few of those. Postdoctoral scholars have gotten scarce in recent years, and synthesis and communication is something the Institute works on, but needs better support, I would offer.
So on the federal side, I would start with the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Project Nearshore Science Team. They were active from 2001 to 2009. They developed a very substantial body of work on the recovery of nearshore ecosystems. They developed the frameworks for thinking about how Puget Sound has changed in the past, for understanding how stressors impact it, and how the projects that are being proposed might help recover shorelines. They went in hiatus in 2009, reflecting the fact that the project had then moved into the Army Corps' process for getting funded. And anyone that's ever been involved in one of those can understand that it went into hibernation in 2009 and is just now coming out of hibernation. But it's great news because this was also announced last week. It looks like the PSNRP will be in the next Water Resources Development Act reauthorization, and it will be funded at the level of $450 million for 3 substantial projects that are a part of a larger grouping. The larger strategy is bigger than the announcement last week, but these 3 projects that were announced, we're talking the removal of roughly 30,000 linear feet of shoreline barriers that are very important for Hood Canal. So you were talking about moving a highway, raising a highway. The impacts of that will be very significant. We're also talking about some recovery in the Nooksack River Delta. That's the anticipated benefits of that are roughly a quarter of the restoration goals for estuarine habitat recovery. So 25% of their target should be met in that one project. The North Fork Skagit River Delta project that's a very big river in the Puget Sound ecosystem, has a lot of impact on the productivity of the estuary. And there we're looking at restoring some of the floodplain and tidal connectivity in the estuary. You know, that area is largely diked off for agricultural purposes, reclaiming a lot of that lost connectivity. That's very important from a salmon recovery point of view. So that can potentially result in the reactivation of the Nearshore science team, bringing them off the ice and out of the closet with mothballs, hopefully. And we look forward to it connecting up with the next thing that I'll mention here. The Memorandum of Understanding that was announced last week also announced a Federal Caucus Science and Monitoring Work Group that will be run under the auspices of the Federal Caucus. And the idea there is to do a much better job of bringing together federal capabilities in the region. You know, we do a lot of important work right now, but it's not really marshaled to support Puget Sound recovery in a interagency working with the state kind of way. It's just largely disconnected and largely in support of our own individual missions. PSP was created to cut across that problem of individual missions not serving the interest of ecosystem recovery, regional ecosystem recovery. So the idea is for the feds to do a better job of helping with that problem, bringing to bear their resources. So one thing I would mention is that, you know, a couple of short-term steps that we can do now with what we have now listing the high priority activities that need help on the collaboration side or the funding side. We can try to find funding for these high priority activities. We can do a better job of integrating with the PSP Science Panel so that their science planning is coordinated with federal science planning. So when our agencies are looking at their discretionary money, they can help support one another. Right now, it's not done so well. But I think the most important part of this is we're going to use this as an opportunity to lay out the vision of what a federal science program could look like in Puget Sound. Something that will require resources, and it will require probably legislation and a real budget that creates this program. And I want to make sure you really kind of take the importance of that. We have the opportunity to help lay out what that thing could look like, and building on what we hear at this workshop, for example, but also getting input from the state side and other interested parties so that we can really gin up something that'll work. So on the one hand, we were stuck in the budget process of the last 8 years, or the lack thereof a budget process for the last 8 years. One of the reasons why the feds haven't really moved on Puget Sound is we haven't had a budget that allows new things to be created. But on the other hand, we're now at the point where we really can have a lot of flexibility in this vision that we put together. So we really hope that that with the little volunteer army that we have right now, that we're going to be able to do that in a meaningful way. So we're hoping to get some bandwidth on that. Okay. So is this one you or me?
This one's you.
Okay. So, among these, the large number of key activities are going on. There's 1,000 points of light. There are lots and lots of small successes, lots and lots of important work focused around particular issues and in particular places. And some of these include NOAA ecosystem assessments for California Current and Puget Sound. That's part of their mission work. The USGS has some funding for a coastal and habitats in Puget Sound landscape project, but it's really not enough money to take it to the next level. It's important process-based work, but it's not funded at the level where we can really make a big impact. The Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project it's a big one. We kind of know what the salmon are doing when they go out to sea, and we can see what they're doing when they come back, but there's a lot of mortality in between those two things, and we don't really understand why. So we're trying to take that apart. Ocean acidification related work is really coming to the fore. On the co-production side, the Sailor Sea Ecosystem Conference, which is held every 2 years. It's a very important conference where a lot of us get together and have an opportunity to talk across science areas, but also to policymakers. The vital signs monitoring work that we're putting together to answer the question, are we making progress towards recovery? That's very under-resourced, as Scott's talking about, but it's there and it's something to build upon. A big driver now is effectiveness assessments. So are recovery projects providing the bang that we hope, and if they're not, what's wrong? That kind of work, extremely important. On the science panel side, we have our science policy forums that we hold every year. We're still trying to get that one down to the point where it's truly effective, but we're trying on that front. On the biennial science work plan, we look at and recommend priority actions and recommendations every 2 years, but again, we don't have our own, we don't have a funding mechanism to fund that work, so we're trying to influence others with that process. I think that's where a federal science program could fit in, is to try to help make that, for example, more of a what should we fund kind of question rather than what should other people fund because we say so kind of situation. And of course we have the advice and review roles as well. And I'm just going to kind of leave it there in the interest of time.
So just a few pieces that then leaves out, and I think let's leave the top bullet alone for a minute. And so Bill's just talked about work plan alignment across the federal situation. I think that's a key missing piece that we have some work underway. And then the third bullet, really, I think we believe we suffer from decision makers who don't understand that they need the model, such as Denise described that Coastal Louisiana uses. The people aren't understanding the value that would add and the how that would be worth the cost. And then when I put that bullet together, one of my science panel leaders said, well, you got to say that scientists also need to be committed to delivering useful information. And I think to Denise's point, sort of follow the lead of others, but be willing to simplify the model so it's useful. I think we need a science community that's there. And then as we continue to move better and better into social sciences, thinking about how traditional ecological knowledge is used, and frankly, every time someone looks at our system, and when you look at our map, you'll do the same thing, is you're only dealing with one side of the border, so full system thinking. Then quickly, let me just say about funding, go on to the next couple of slides. We don't have separate science element funding for our program. We don't have any set aside with the allocation to the National Estuary Program that so much will go to research and monitoring. So we really borrow from these implementation funds, which helps with the co-production side of things, but really doesn't allow us to build the science horsepower that we've imagined would really serve the system well. Then the next slide. And that's true also on the salmon recovery side. We do see a really nice blend of federal, state, local, even private investment. And on this side of things, we have seen some better articulation of how much, what % of the effort should be devoted to science. But even that is a bit spotty. So I think our answer to what's the funding for science, it sort of depends on people's willingness in a program to invest in science. And finally.
So I'm gonna leave on some things that we've done pretty well and that we're proud of in Puget Sound. I mean, we've been kind of delivering a message of, we're not coordinated enough, and a lot of kind of bad news. I think there is some good news going on in Puget Sound. I think one is that we take social science very seriously in Puget Sound. That doesn't necessarily mean we fund it well, but that's not a reflection of its perceived importance. That's a reflection of our funding realities. A group that spun from the Puget Sound Partnership Science Panel to include researchers from the University of Washington and other places. They've been meeting over the years and have really put together an impressive body of work supporting the human well-being indicators side, for example, of the PSP recovery goals, really bringing that in. We've been looking in how to use structured decision-making in a way to support recovery planning and implementation. So I don't really have a lot of time to talk about that, but there's a lot going on there that's very important, and we recognize that. The integrated ecosystem model for Puget Sound being spearheaded by NOAA. It's a marine food web model. The Atlantis model, and they're linking it to biogeochemical cycling. It's very cutting edge, very impressive stuff. But it's, that's NOAA's mission. It's the marine side. It's not the landward side. We want to try to think about what an integrated ecosystem model that includes the land side might look like and put that together in the future. On the climate change and ocean acidification side, some very good work going on at the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington and elsewhere, summarizing that information in a State of Knowledge report that came out last year. Very good stuff. At USGS, we're trying to put together some work that'll help think about the implications of sea level rise. And our claim is that you have to think about the importance of that within the context of storms and within the context of river flooding changes. So the big floods occur under that very unlikely event of a big storm, a very high tide, sea level rise at the same time with river flooding. That's when things really happen. Very large implications for habitats, floodplain recovery, estuary recovery. That's a kind of big thing. It's $1 million a year for 5 years. In Puget Sound, that's a big deal. But when that's developed, it'll hopefully be very useful. On the eDNA front, we're exploring work so we can think about salmon patterns with limited resources. A lot of interesting work going on there, and they're now at the point where they're looking at using eDNA to think about numbers of fish, not just presence, absence, and a lot of interesting directions. But in the interest of time, I'll end the good news, okay? But we can always talk about more of it later. Okay, so that's, we don't really have a pretty questions ending slide. So this is a metaphor for the way we work there. The feds and the state, we're not quite.
You were going to hand it to me.
We're not quite connected, but we're doing our best.
We do have time for a few questions. Lisa?
So I want to warn you, I'm one of those social scientists scattered in the crowd here, so I have a particular bias probably, and I'm coming from the Chesapeake Bay program. But I want to challenge you a little bit on this idea that you're treating the system as an integrated socio-ecological system. And you allude to some stuff here that I probably don't know everything about, but when you presented your, say, water quality goals separate from your socioeconomic goals, I have to immediately wonder, when you set water quality goals, you're implicitly asking people to change their behavior to make trade-offs. And I'm picking on you. I probably could say this about any program because it's how the clean water regs are written, that it's scientists who decide what the water quality goals are. But I've been challenging folks in the Bay program, and trust me, when you eventually get to paying for this, people start asking very difficult questions about those water quality goals. So we economists are trying to suggest that those kinds of decisions are really socio-political goals right from the get-go, and that a truly integrated system would be looking at what are the trade-offs of setting those water quality goals. So that's just my one example, and I'd like to hear.
It's like you were in the room when as soon as we set targets, which we were so very proud of, but we did it for each of those wedges in our vital sign diagram. Our science panel, including social scientists, said, the real story is how do these fit together? Do they fit together? And if so, what gives? And so that's the space, you're right, that's the space we're in. We're glad to have those up there in front of us, but we're unsure really how to crack that problem. And one thing we are encouraged about is a member of our leadership council is very keen that as we adopt those vital signs, we don't just use them as part of our monitoring system to record, to track progress, but that we also do impact analysis about those vital signs. So what's the effect of an action, proposed action on culture, on sense of place, on outdoor recreation? So we intend to infuse the dialogue about actions, whether they be focused on a species recovery outcome or something else, a little more broadly. But that's probably only part of the answer.
The one thing I would add to that is there's another bite at that apple. The way that we're trying to organize implementing ecosystem recovery on top of all this other work is through the development of implementation strategies, picking off a large part of the problem. So for example, a shoreline recovery implementation strategy or a stormwater related implementation strategy. So within that implementation strategy process, we can think about questions that aren't so neatly addressed within the framework of the goals as we've laid them out. We can get our sleeves and go into the real world as we do that. I would also say that we view a good bit of how to do that from the adaptive challenge point of view, where we're not giving folks a roadmap on how to solve the problem. We're helping work with them to define the problem so that they can help figure out how to solve the problem. And I think you can get into issues like that when you're involving the people on the ground to try to help do that. Now, I say we're doing that, we're trying to get people to understand better what that means, that adaptive challenge versus technical challenge.
Other questions? Steve?
Did I understand that you said that there was a $450 million three-project restoration funds coming through? Is any part of that at all set aside for science?
That's a very good question. And what I'll tell you is that the timing of that announcement is driven by the transition. So it's really a red bow, but there's some loose ends flapping below. I can't tell you exactly what's in that because it's in reconciliation right now. It hasn't really signed into law quite yet. But my understanding from what I've heard is that the science and monitoring world isn't going to jump up and down with what's mentioned there explicitly. Monitoring is covered, but it's not really, there's no creation of a science program like in the Everglades. There's no science program to go along with PSNRP at this point. So we're trying to use the other side of that, the Federal Caucus Memorandum of Understanding side, to try to help fill that role. But the charge is broader than PSNRP. But that's how we would try to tackle that, is a parallel science program to help support PSNRP, among other things.
If I could just piggyback on that, I think one of the things I learned listening to the prior presentation was, getting some projects in the plan conceptually is one thing, and then all the science that's needed beyond that. And I just don't understand in that Army Corps of Engineers investment scheme how much more science they're willing to invest in, and what kinds of science. So I'll be interested in helping to work that out.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and you've already partially acknowledged this, but Puget Sound and the Great Lakes are somewhat unique in that they're transnational. You already acknowledged that you're addressing one half of the problem, and that might be hard enough, but I was curious on more details and if there's been an effort to coordinate and leverage funding or to coordinate research with Canada as well.
Yeah, there's been a history of attempting to coordinate, and it benefited in the early 1990s from the governor and premier signing an environmental cooperation agreement, and we formed transboundary task forces, including some on science and monitoring. And what almost immediately happened is that we fell back to the U.S. side of the work group got together, and the BC side and the Canadian side of the work group got together. And it's just a really hard culture to break through, and it's really been hard to break through because of, not to say that we have stable politics here or political leadership, but the federal government's come in and out of that system. The province has been agreeable or not to working with us. It continues to be a big challenge. We're pretty hopeful that the energy around the Transboundary Conference and some simple indicators reporting leads us in that direction, but we're most hopeful, I think, that it'll be about shared discussion about what the problems are, and that the solution space is, in most cases, not going to be transboundary.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and let's go all the way to the back of the room to John Rubin.
Here in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, it appears to some that there's a myopic kind of focus on a few of the stressors as a result of species being listed and those few stressors having a federal nexus, and as a result having greater attention because of consultation under the Endangered Species Act. In your presentation, you touch on species that are listed, but quickly turn to the efforts being focused on watershed or ecosystem. I'm wondering if in your experience in the Puget Sound, you have focus on particular stressors, or if you've been able to avoid that, as at least I was hearing your presentation.
What I would say is we have enough issues that it's not as bad as a myopic focus on one little thing. It's more like a myopic focus on 26 different things. And we're doing our bit because we have so many little things. It does give you a little bit of a look into the larger ecosystem, and I really do think that we do need to think bigger and to think at that higher level and how to bring those things together. we most certainly do. But we are, maybe a small place, but it's a very complicated set of issues that we're wrestling with. So that's both good and bad. It does divide our forces a lot, but we don't get wrapped around one axle.
And maybe to the detriment of what the tribes and NOAA Fisheries have pointed out about our inability to protect existing habitat. You know, it might be that we've swung the pendulum too far away from what you're describing here.
Thank you, Scott and Bill.